Hi. Thanks, everyone. Thanks particularly, Andrew, for reaching out to me. I'm incredibly grateful for it. I am incredibly incoherent as a general rule, and so that's why I like to break things out into tiny bite-sized pieces. That's what I've tried to do. The last time I performed in front of such an august, distinguished, and large group of people was when I was an undergrad, and I was doing an interpretive dance on stage, stabbing myself with a rubber knife, and I was wearing a red fez, a dirty white singlet, and an enormous cloth diaper. So it's likely that this experience will be only slightly less embarrassing than that, and for that I'm incredibly grateful to you all. So we don't have a huge amount of time, and so I'm going to move very quickly. Chances are you won't understand a lot of what I'm saying because I'm going to speak in a kind of hieroglyphic gibberish, but tough for you guys. So basically, Andrew was talking about how I'm a passionate obsessive about the future, and that's because, like a lot of you, I'm guessing, I read too much science fiction as a kid. So naturally, given that I'm obsessed with the future, I'm going to talk about the New Deal. The New Deal was, in my view, this incredibly successful conservative project to dramatically transform a country that was going to hell in a handbasket. And now, as a lot of you know, there is a tremendous anxiety about where America is going in the future, and I think it would be useful to look back at that time and the things that we can and can't learn from that period of time. So I have a couple of theses that I'm going to run through, and then a couple of antitheses. Like a good conservative, I'm going to draw on Hegel, who is, of course, the great inspiration for Karl Marx. So first, the first thesis is the idea that the New Deal actually invented modern America. In the 1920s, if you wanted to buy a house, the only mortgage you could get would be about 50% of the purchase price of that house. And you would have to put half of the money down in a down payment, and to get that down payment, you would have to put down another secondary mortgage that would have a really high rate of interest. We're talking about in the high teens, something like that. So naturally, very few Americans actually own their own home. Now, during the early stage of the New Deal, FDR created a variety of programs ranging from the Works Progress Administration and a lot of other public jobs programs. And he was worrying, like a lot of Democrats in the current administration, that this involved spending a huge amount of public money, and he wanted to find some way of ginning up economic growth without using the government per se. So again, that sounds like an idea that a lot of folks on the right and left would embrace in the present. And what he came up with was this very clever idea. He came up with the idea of manufacturing an enormous housing boom. Now, we all know how well that turned out. Well, it actually turns out that back then it turned out very well indeed, because you saw this dramatic improvement in the kind of housing stock that most Americans were living in. You guys will recall that FDR gave a famous speech about how 1/3 of Americans were ill-fed, ill-housed, ill-clothed. And that problem of being ill-housed was not completely solved, but we did make a tremendous amount of progress in that regard by creating an economy built on consumer debt. And the way that he was able to do that was creating a couple of institutions. One of them was called the Federal Housing Administration, and another one was called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So how was he able to do that? Well, he drew on a great insight from private business. In charge of the FHA, he put these two guys who ran something called the General Motors Acceptance Corporation. Henry Ford is best known for having this brilliant insight of, if I pay my workers $5 a day, which was then an enormously handsome, generous wage, they will be able to afford to buy automobiles. General Motors had an even cleverer idea. Rather than paying our workers this large wage, what we'll do is teach people to buy things on the installment plan. And so the installment plan spread from GM, and then it spread to housing, and then it spread throughout our entire economy. And the idea of ginning up a housing boom has been an idea that's been kind of the American answer to industrial policy ever since then. It's happened in a lot of different ways since then, but you also saw something like this happen in, of course, the 1990s and in the 2000s. You had this period where you had the skill-biased technical change, which meant that lots of Americans who only had a high school education or less, which, by the way, was 3/4 of Americans in 1940, now a much smaller number, but still a significant number. Those Americans were having a hard time finding sort of good, high-paying jobs. Where did they find those jobs? They found those jobs in the construction center. And so you had this global economy where you saw the emergence of what Ben Bernanke, the chair of the Federal Reserve now, but then only a Federal Reserve governor, referred to as a global savings glut. You had this situation where you had lots of folks in East Asia producing cheap manufactured goods that Americans could consume and pay for on the installment plan. And that would be something that, even though their wages were stagnant, allowed them to feel as though they were affluent. It felt fizzy. It felt like they were moving ahead. Whereas if you look at the top third of earners, the most affluent Americans, actually they faced a much higher effective inflation rate. They faced a higher effective inflation rate because more of their consumption happened in the form of consuming labor-intensive services. So you saw this kind of funny situation, but it's something that worked and something that maintained social peace in a time of rising economic inequality. Now, what happened recently is that that consumer debt fizz suddenly went away. And then you saw a huge amount of economic anger with people who finally realized that, wait a second, I can't stretch myself that far. Wait a second, the house that I bought isn't actually worth as much as I thought it was. Wait a second, the economy is not what I believed it to be. You saw this kind of bubble burst. So again, so much of the growth that we've seen was fueled by this turn towards a consumption-oriented economy, and it was a tremendously good thing, and it would be foolish of us to say that FDR had some kind of terrible idea in mind. In fact, we can attribute a huge amount of progress to that idea. But it was a very problematic idea, and where does that leave us now? So as of 2007, the most recent time we have statistics on this stuff, you have the situation where the bottom 40% of American earners have a debt-to-disposable income ratio of 133%. The bottom 40% of earners account for 12% of all consumption that happens in our economy. When you're looking at the richest 10%, they account for 42% of all consumption. That's one reason why a lot of folks are calling the America of the present a plutonomy. The idea that our economy is really governed by the people who have the disposable income to kind of make consumer markets move. And they have a debt-to-disposable income ratio of 112%, basically pretty manageable. But then what about that other half of the population? The folks between the 40th percentile and the 90th percentile. Their ratio of debt to disposable income is 205%. That means that a lot of these folks are effectively underwater. And what that means is that for the next 10 years, maybe even the next 20 years, they are going to be paying down this debt. They're going to be consuming radically less than they have been, which is why so many of us are talking about this idea of radically re-engineering our economy in such a way that we're going to be consuming less. But the thing is, what happens in those circumstances? That incredible consumer fizz, that incredible prosperity that we've been talking about, is something that has also fueled a lot of environmental devastation. This is something that's come up. But it's also something that's fueled a lot of moral progress as well. There was only one time in the modern history of the world when you had an economic calamity that didn't also lead to an upsurge in violence, an upsurge in selfishness, an upsurge in racial oppression and prejudice. And that was arguably during the New Deal. And that was because we set off this amazing consumer debt spiral that made people feel more prosperous, maybe more prosperous than they really were on the basis of what they were actually producing. So that's a very scary thought, the idea that without this kind of thin, maybe even fake prosperity, this chintzy prosperity, that we actually might be living in a much angrier and more dangerous kind of climate. So that's one thing to think about. The New Deal invented modern America, and now we're in this dangerous, kind of uncharted, very unfamiliar territory. The New Deal also arguably invented the nuclear family, and this is where the conservatism of the New Deal came in. The conservatism of the New Deal isn't just about the fact that FDR wanted to preserve a kind of free enterprise economy. It also came in the fact that a key component of the New Deal movement came in the form of maternalists, these women who were social workers who were highly educated and who noted that in the United States you saw this dramatic increase in divorce rates between 1900 and 1920. You had a huge crime explosion that was happening at that time. And you also had this kind of advent of urbanization and social change very familiar to those of us who've lived in this kind of post-60s environment. And so a lot of what these highly educated women wanted to do was create family arrangements in which women would not be in the workforce. Whereas you saw the spike in women in the workforce, they wanted to take women out of the workforce. That is, they wanted to actively discriminate against women in favor of men. It was this idea that I think today conservatives, liberals, pretty much everyone would consider totally psychotic, not only because women have more than the majority of America's brain power, but it was an idea that seemed to make sense at the time because, again, they were dealing with this problem of rising infant mortality, and they thought, what is the way that we can actually make this work? And so for a while, that seemed to work. Marriage rates increased, the birth rate increased, we call that the baby boom, and also crime rates plummeted. You saw this marvelous, apparently marvelous, 50s moment in which you seem to have this kind of tremendous degree of kind of social peace, social solidarity. But a lot of the reason why you had that kind of social solidarity and the reason you were able to build a kind of larger government and you were able to build this consensus around it was because you also had an unusually low proportion of foreign-born Americans at that time, an unusually low percentage of Americans who were speaking foreign languages. You also had the situation in which Americans weren't being truly represented in our political institutions. Women were obviously being subordinated in a variety of ways. And also, you didn't have the principle of one man, one vote. Once you had one man, one vote, that accounts for a lot of the kind of cultural and sexual revolution that we've seen in this country since. And it's one reason why it would be very hard to recreate New Deal politics. The idea of creating a thicker, more interventionist government really rests on, to a very high degree, social solidarity. And the tragedy is that social solidarity and diversity are in tension with each other. I'm someone who is a great believer in diversity. I've always lived in diverse neighborhoods, diverse communities. But the danger is that racial diversity tends to lead pretty robustly to less redistribution, and it also tends to lead to less social trust. So when we're talking about these dramatic demographic changes that we're going through that Robert kind of pointed at during his presentation that Rinku was also describing, you're looking at a world in which you're going to see a higher level of normative diversity. So by 2050, according to this middle series projection, 1/5 of all Americans are going to be foreign-born, and a much higher proportion are going to be in the second generation. And also that mix is going to be a very different kind of mix, in part because here's an interesting statistic that's really important to keep in mind for everyone. A single child replaces one of his or her parents, but not both, obviously. Nor do single-child families contribute much to future population. The 17.4% of baby boomer women who had only one child account for a mere 7.8% of children born in the next generation. By contrast, nearly a quarter of the children of baby boomers descend from the mere 11% of baby boomer women who had 4 or more children. These circumstances are leading to the emergence of a new society whose members will disproportionately be descended from parents who rejected the social tendencies that once made childlessness and small families the norm. These values include an adherence to traditional, even patriarchal religion, and a strong identification with one's own smaller community within this larger, more diverse country. You see this among all kinds of micro-populations. For example, among the Jewish population, you see ultra-Orthodox communities that are the ones that are reproducing at high rates. The Syrian Jews are reproducing at far higher rates than the kind of secular Ashkenazim. You see this in the United States, you see this in Israel as well. You see this across the board. So what we're seeing is the situation where, everyone in this room thinks of themselves as global citizens. And I think that I'm sympathetic to that view. But this America that's going to have a population of 450 million or more is going to consist of a lot of people who don't have that framework, who don't share the values of a lot of the folks in this room. That doesn't mean that they don't care about the future of the world. That doesn't mean that they don't care about just the future of our environment. But it means they're going to have radically different priorities. So the question is, for the United States as a whole, how do you govern in this scenario? How do you build a consensus that is going to apply to Hmongs, Mormons, and Hutterites, the populations that have the highest birth rates, as well as the kind of, secular hipster liberals that I, live among, and that a lot of you, I imagine, live among as well? It's going to be very, very, very difficult. One of the reasons why the New Deal was such a dramatic and transformative project is because elites in this country had much, much more power circa the 1940s, the 1950s. And when you're looking at the conservative movement of today, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with it. It seems less genteel to them than the conservative movement that we associated with someone like William F. Buckley Jr. But the thing is that when William F. Buckley Jr. was the face of American conservatism was very different. Very few people had access to microphones. And so for Bill Buckley to say, hey, you John Birchers, I don't like the way that you sound, I'm going to tell you to shut up, it actually worked. But today, you cannot tell 10% of the country to shut up. You can't tell 30% of the country to shut up if they disagree with you. It's just not an option, as much as conservatives and liberals want that to be the case. And so that, I think, is where the future of conservatism is going to come from, whether we like it or not. It's not going to be necessarily the movement conservatism that we see today, which is a conservatism that, frankly, is incoherent in a lot of ways, that doesn't make a lot of sense, that can be very frustrating. It's going to be what you might call a meta-conservatism, a conservatism in which a city like New York or a city like Portland is going to have free mass transit and free love. And then you're going to have other communities in the middle of the country that are going to look very, very different, where the population is going to be 30% Hmong, 30% Hutterite, and 30% Mormon, and a couple of other people are going to do the computer programming and a variety of other things. So this country is going to be very different from the country that we're all familiar with now. It's going to be a country full of creative tension and also just tension, period. And like Robert, I'm actually broadly very optimistic about what this country is going to look like, but rest assured, it is not going to be exactly what you imagine. Thanks a lot, guys.